I'm going to talk a bit about myself. My involvement with putting von Geraud on the map began with that painting, which is the cover of the current exhibition catalogue, which I bought for the Art Gallery of New South Wales when I was in charge of Australian art and of all art there in 1967. I was shocked to discover when I went to work in Sydney that they didn't own anything whatsoever by von Geraud. A very parochial, provincial collection it was, to some extent still is. Like all state galleries, they're all a bit parochial, a bit over-interested in their own state and less interested in other states. And fairly quickly, Fred Williams noticed it and did a copy of it, sort of in honour of von Geraud, but also he recognised a fellow feeling for strong composition. You would have discovered lately, looking at your wonderful Fred Williams exhibition, that Cézanne is his principal influence, the great artist of structure, of observation and structure combined. So that's von Geraud, a great observer and a great constructor of compositions. So is Fred Williams, and so is Cézanne. And then Imants Tillers has copied Fred's copy of von Geraud. And he, of course, goes less for structure than for fame. He just likes grabbing, in an Andy Warhol type of way, somebody else's modicum of fame. So you can look at those later on by yourself. There's a bit of poem that Imants has added to his title. The next element in my making von Geraud a bit more famous than he'd been, because, like Ron, I had no awareness of von Geraud in the 1940s and 50s before Ron was born. But when I was first looking at art at NGV Melbourne, he might not have been on the walls and he wasn't being brought to my attention anyway. And that's because perhaps the works there were not quite as good as they should have been. But when Joseph Brown bought that from an auction, it had been released from a big collection of colonial art and a lot of von Geraud paintings in England, a wool buyer, a wool prince family, the Dalgettis, had retired to England around 1860 with a lot of von Gerauds. That was one of them. And Joseph Brown bought it, and I wanted to put it on the cover of his book. So from 1973 onwards, it was pretty famous. And von Geraud began to be famous because that painting was famous. Next, in 1980, I'd shifted from Art Gallery of New South Wales to National Gallery of Australia, and we did this big exhibition with Candice Bruce as the principal curator, and put onto it this other fabulous painting, which has also been copied by Imants Tillers, and if it could be opened out, you will see that on the back, upstairs later on, you can look at that part, and I'm telling you, that's an improvement upon nature. The title of my talk is Von Geraud the Aesthete, Improving on Nature. He cheats. He's indeed a great observer, but he also improves upon nature to make a better composition. All those rocks are invented. Same way as things are invented in this Poetry Gully, and things are invented behind you in Stony Rises Corangamite. He invented those rocks on the left simply to have a better composition and to do what he does often, to make the observer's eye go round in a circle or an oval. I will emphasize several times that circular movement around a composition in his art is one of his characteristics, and it's over there in the, whatever it's called at Tower Hill. The painting is called Tower Hill. Up from the ground into the air, into clouds and down again, the earth breathing, transpiration of moisture and air. He perhaps has never said he was composing pictures that way, but there's no harm in all of us interpreting what an artist has done any way we wish. And a cat may look at a king is the proverb that goes with that one. And if I want to interpret a painting as about the earth breathing and circulating air and life, well, I may, and you may too, because I see that in von Gerard. And finally, when Fern Tree Gully had been given by Joseph Brown to the National Gallery and was no longer part of his collection, the third edition of the book of the Joseph Brown collection had to have a different von Gerard on the cover, and I'm going to force you later on, after I've stopped speaking, to go up on your own and look again at that painting, because I think it is indeed a masterpiece owned by National Victoria, and it's extremely, exceedingly, very Australian. Whereas this, I believe, is not very Australian. It had huge success because it was not very Australian, because it appealed to settler audiences in Melbourne, and it appealed again in 1862 to an international audience at the International Exhibition in London, not the Crystal Palace of 1851, but the South Kensington International Expo of 1862. It was admired there. And so there's a cultural reason, as well as an expatriate homesickness reason, for it being very interesting and admired by settler Australians in Melbourne and an absolutely international audience in London in 1862. And of course, anybody from overseas who sees it now, of course, would get excited about it too, for similar reasons. But that requires a culture and an eye that has got tuned in more to Australia, its peculiar geology and so on. And the flatness, the horizontality, the big sky, all of which are totally absent from this and most of his paintings, and living sheltered in a sheltered hollow in the dry, hot, stony plains is part of the Australianness. And the subject, above the sheltered homestead and the water supply, a woolshed, the source of Australia's wealth at the time, 1860s, about 10 years later than this painting, above a kind of below a kind of sacred mountain, a temple, a sacred mountain, the source of wealth, endless pastures, very, very Australian. Flatness and emptiness, which Fred Williams, of course, saw as the great Australian quality, flatness and emptiness. Now, at last, Fern Tree Gully itself. It was first exhibited in December 1857. It had been painted that year, partly from sketches of fern trees, one of which is visible there in a tiny sketchbook, one of many of his sketches of tree ferns, and that is dated February from a year or two earlier, I forget how many years earlier. So that means he had been there in the hottest part of the year. January, February, it can be horrible in Melbourne. And in Melbourne, people often want to escape from their horrible dry heat to somewhere cool like the beach, which wasn't very common in the 1850s, instead to cool fern glades. So its coolness is one of the things above all that the audience in its own day admired. Partly because in Melbourne, they were settlers who wore more clothes than we do these days. At least women in the big city would wear more clothes than, I don't know about men in the bush. They probably dressed appropriately for bush work. But the heat and perhaps the smelliness of attending an exhibition without air conditioning or much ventilation in December, January 1857 would make a person attending an exhibition with a painting of coolness, extreme coolness, would make people extra interested in that painting. Similarly, even worse in London, the crowds are greater, the exhibition spaces for international exhibitions are still unventilated and smelly and nasty. The coolness of this painting for a London audience in the summer of 1862 would have been very, very appealing. So that's why when you look at a lithograph based on the painting, for it was so popular that he started making lots of replicas, sometimes a tiny replica. He's a good businessman in some ways, a tiny replica, you can look at that later, which would sell well. But 10 years later, he produced an album of lithographs, and some of them are visible upstairs. This is a facsimile, and it has a slightly different title, and it's slightly different in other ways, but the text that accompanies it mentions above all the ice-cold water. Ice-cold is a little stream. And the coolness of suddenly coming from a hot hillside into the shelter of the tree ferns gets mentioned by everybody who visits that particular tiny microclimate at what is now called Fern Tree Gully, a suburb of Melbourne these days, 20 miles, I don't know how many kilometres that is, 20 miles or so out of Melbourne then. And once this painting became so famous, it instantly created a bit of a tourist industry out of Melbourne for picnics and excursions to this particular place, which had hitherto been called Dobson's Gully, with Dobson's sawmill right beside it. But it instantly got its name changed to Fern Tree Gully and has had that name ever since. The text in the book of lithographs, we don't quite know who wrote it, but I suspect it was the art critic for the Melbourne Argus, a newspaper at the time, whose name was James Smith. It's, to me, slightly his style. He's a bit of a commercial journalist as well as an art critic. He would do quite a lot of writing for money. So whoever published the expensive album possibly commissioned a professional journalistic writer like James Smith to do the text. And I'm going to read some bits out. It combines vivid verdure, cool freshness, shadowy softness of an English woodland stream. Nonsense, but at least that reminds people of home, home being England if they were still immigrants, with the luxuriant richness and graceful forms of tropical vegetation. Well, it's not tropical, it's temperate climates that Victoria has, but it looks perhaps like subtropical or genuinely tropical scenery, even though tree ferns are not palm trees. The accident of tree ferns looking like palm trees and tropical landscape were very fashionable in science more than in art. And von Gerard already had contact with important scientists who were mostly fellow Germans in Melbourne, and he would have known that the international celebrity scientist, Humboldt, was mad about paintings that celebrated the tropics and put palm trees at their centre. So that's sort of background to how 10 years after this was painted, the graceful forms of tropical vegetation get mentioned in the note in the fairly... the lithographs are intended to circulate more widely than a painting ever would. Then we get a rill welling out from the summit or the shoulders of a lofty range. Well, it's not lofty, it's only the Dandenongs. Hurries down its shaggy sides, not very shaggy, wearing a channel for itself. Oh, this is an awareness of geology, that's fine. Wearing a channel for itself, trickling and sparkling over the mossy boulders which impede but scarcely divert its course, blah, blah, blah. And on either side, nature builds up a vista of rounded columns, architectural term, sometimes attaining a height of 30 feet. Astonishing height for a fern. And from their summits spring out the exquisitely curved and brilliantly green fronds of the fern tree, overarching the ice-cold brook below and constituting one of the loveliest cloisters it is possible to imagine. He's pressing endless buttons there, not only the fashion in science for the tropics, but also basic religion, cloisters, monasteries, churches, and the physical button of coolness in a hot country where you were still perhaps wearing too much clothing. The banks of the ravine, well, it's not a ravine, it's only a gum tree hollow in a small mountain, a small hill, are carpeted with aromatic shrubs and creepers, among which the musk and the dogwood occupy a prominent place. So he's pressing the button of another sense, the sense of smell, as well as the sense of temperature. You're meant to think about nice smells. From the gully, matted with this delicate and fragrant tapestry, another button being pressed of luxury in the Middle Ages and royalty and Louis XIV and Versailles and the Gothic castles. This delicate and fragrant tapestry arise the giants of the forest, the lofty eucalypts. Well, lofty eucalypts are growing, but dead tree trunks of lofty eucalypts are highly visible and highly conspicuous in order to, I think, indicate death goes along with life. Blackwood trees, straight as a javelin, I don't know which ones are them, and branchless until they attain an altitude of 200 or 250 feet. And already Australian eucalypts near Melbourne were becoming world famous for their extreme height. It's the kind of attitude just of simple bigness, which is a perfectly natural response to a tree, and very much the Bob Brown response to some trees he still tries to save in the Tasmanian forests. An altitude 250 feet, when they spread their plumes to the sun and air. The wind may be, quote, chanting a thunder psalm, unquote, and another reference to going to church and religion, chanting a thunder psalm overhead, but below all is calm and silent and fragrant and cool. Save for the musical ripple of the mountain brook or the peculiar note of the lyrebird. I'm not sure von Gerard had ever heard a lyrebird, which doesn't have a peculiar note. It's famous for imitating many, many notes, represented in the foreground of the picture. Dead centre, deliberately conspicuous, whose graceful plumage seems to have been designed to harmonize with the exquisite forms of the surrounding foliage. So that's the real sales pitch about the quality of the art, about the aesthetics, and it helps. It would have helped sell it as an aesthetic thrill in its day. And he goes on to say, the scene lies in the vicinity of the southern Dandenong sawmill. Oh, it's about 25 miles from Melbourne. As there is a comfortable hotel in the immediate neighbourhood, the gully is a favourite resort for summer tourists. One wonders if the hotel helped subsidise the expensive publication. A clearance in the forest has enabled the artist to represent the fern trees unenclosed by that dense warp and woof of vegetation by which they are genuinely environed. Now a little bit about botany and about lyrebirds. In this fabulous catalogue raisonné of all the von Gerards that were known when this was published sometime in the 1980s, there are full transcripts of practically every account that every newspaper made when it was first exhibited in 1857. And lots of newspapers went to great length to say things about this painting. And one of them was quite sure what this tree is, whereas Tim Bonyhady, who's a fabulous expert on the history of eco-conscious art in Australia, and you probably listen to him speak here, he checked with present-day botanists and they couldn't produce any identification for that tree, which of course is terrific as a compositional element. It does what I've already mentioned, forces the eye to go up and then perhaps to come down again, a constant cycle of coolness and drying up and breathing and transpiration and living and dying. A journalist in the Melbourne or in something, a few weeks after it was first exhibited, says, near the eye, a musk tree. Well, that in fact is, botanically speaking today, Olearia argophylla, which present-day botanists couldn't say that was Olearia argophylla. But when the journalist in 1857 asked von Gerard what the tree was, well, I presume the journalist did that. A serious journalist would. He wouldn't say it was a musk tree unless he'd got some source. Von Gerard must have intended it to be a musk tree, without any doubt. So he cheats. He improves upon nature, as all good artists have to do. The science isn't everything. Art is equal to science, and in my view, sometimes more important than science. What other interesting things about nature? No, not about nature. So, yeah, birds. I've already said that I sometimes wonder, when the peculiar note of the lyrebird is mentioned, if von Gerard ever saw a lyrebird at all. There are no sketches in his sketchbooks of a lyrebird except one completely isolated from any context of an expedition or an excursion. And it looks very like this. And that is not a possible attitude or pose for a lyrebird. It's impossible. When the lyre-shaped tail is up, and it's usually down, trailing on the ground, but if you want to see it when it's up, you can't really, because it's... Look, Google lyrebirds on the internet, and you'll see images of the lyrebird's tail coming right over, parallel with its back, so the tip of the lyre is sort of on the back of the lyrebird's head. Not a very good way of illustrating the lyre-shaped tail if you try to do it as it would be seen on the actual lyrebird. But a taxidermy lyrebird, a stuffed lyrebird in a glass case, or perhaps not in a museum but even in a private house, because I think the colonial artist Louisa Meredith, Mrs. Meredith, I think I remember reading that she once saw, I was a bit shocked, lyrebird tails separated from lyrebirds, dead lyrebirds presumably, and mounted as ornamental things on the walls of houses. And this much lesser contemporary of von Gerard called Nicolas Chevalier, already mentioned by Ron Radford, he once did, perhaps stimulated by this painting, a design for a fancy dress to wear at a fancy dress ball, for the wife of the Governor of Victoria to wear perhaps, and she was holding a fan, which was a lyrebird tail. I hope she didn't actually do it. I hope it was only a suggestion, a costume idea from Nicolas Chevalier. I think von Gerard didn't copy, as Ruth Pullin says she did when she edited my text. I don't think he copied some other artist's drawing. I think he copied a stuffed bird. There's another bird here with its tail down, like hunting for little insects to eat. Most people would assume, and I assume, that they were both, that they were a male and female in a mating display. But Tim Bonyhady established that no, they are both male birds. Present-day ornithologists advised that that was the case. Von Gerard might have realized that the lyrebirds had become more interesting than he'd intended. By 1868, I'm quoting something in the Argus newspaper again. A journalist had seen another painting, and in 1860 said, "Whoever paints Ferntree Gully," not a painting by von Gerard, "whoever paints Ferntree Gully, you always have one or more lyrebirds conspicuous in the foreground. Even Mr. Gerard supplies the market in them in any number." I think the journalist is exaggerating, but there have been some replicas. And, says the journalist quite wrongly, the lyrebirds that Mr. Gerard supplies in any number are at least the size of turkey buzzards. So that means the idea of lyrebirds in the gully had become a big idea, as big as turkey buzzards. But whether it is the painter who has painted them out of existence, they were not to be seen at Ferntree Gully the day the journalist visited in 1868. So when von Gerard did replicas of this composition in pen and ink drawings, one of which is on the walls there, and before photographic reproduction and before lithographic reproduction, artists would often do this. They would repeat perhaps sets and series, up to 20 or 30 characteristic drawings of the landscape scenery that they were now living amongst. And there are at least two, perhaps three sets of 30 or so drawings that von Gerard did. One of them found their way, I think, to a king of Austria, something like that. That sort of client might get them in the end, but they'd become presentations for a governor of the colony of Victoria who might be departing. And he left the lyrebirds out of those series of pen and ink replicas. But by the time we get to the 1860s, when this journalist wrote this comment about all the turkey buzzard-sized lyrebirds in Mr. Gerard's paintings of Ferntree Gully, and that's when the lithographs got made, the lyrebirds reappear in the composition in the lithograph. And this time it's not two males, one with a tail up and the other with a tail down. It really is a mateship display in the lithograph. But the tail is still up in the way that it would not be in real life. So he might be a great observer, Mr. von Gerard, of geology and plants and extensive landscape, but not perhaps of animals. Which brings me to something that's not visible here but upstairs. I've always thought that a couple of paintings have a fox secretly heading towards some wallabies to eat them. An eco-conscious subject, the introduced fox, which I've just learnt this morning from the research library, was indeed introduced by the 1840s, a good 10 years before it first occurs in von Gerard's paintings. It's a fairly probable fox. I don't think it's a dingo the two times it occurs, but even if it is a dingo, I'm sure they hunted marsupials to eat. So how eco-conscious was von Gerard? Possibly he really was. So the two foxes, which are probably foxes, not dingoes, that you can find upstairs when you hunt one day, are probably there on purpose to suggest European settlers have introduced some bad things, not only rabbits, but also foxes, and they will eat the lovely kangaroos. Back to this painting, and a different thing besides the lyrebirds that got observed by the first writers. And this is popular culture, or mid-cult culture, that would have been in everybody's minds in the 1850s. To many, the painting will realize their conception of some of those lovely forest glades through which Bernardin Saint-Pierre has led us. That's the name of a novelist, French, from the late 18th century, like 50 years before the painting was done. So it's still popular culture in a sense. Bernardin Saint-Pierre has led us in the story of Paul and Virginia. That is one of the hottest novels, slightly erotic. Adolescents, a boy and a girl, lost their parents or been shipwrecked. I've forgotten, I've never read it. I think operas have been done based on Paul et Virginie. It is on Mauritius that they were lost, all alone. They weren't brother and sister. They did fall in love when they were just perhaps not quite old enough to really properly fall in love. It was on the cusp of not quite okay eroticism, but it was apparently just acceptable for the widest audience, this novel of a young boy and a young girl falling in love all alone, perhaps with not many clothes on, in the warm tropical palm trees of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. So that is being referred to by the very first journalists, art critics who saw this painting in Melbourne. Then, a bit further on, another bit of literature. Tranquil Pleasure calls up a host of images associated with old readings in poetry and romance, and embodies on the canvas as accurately as though the painting is designed as an illustration of the passage, the picture of which Spenser, that's the Elizabethan period, the Fairy Queen poem, in a poem called The Fairy Queen, Spenser's given us the words of the wood, a glade, into which Belle Phoebe and her nymphs conducted Timaeus. So that must be a love, male and female love event going on in a place like this, in Spenser's The Fairy Queen. A pleasant glade, a whole verse is quoted. And then from some source that is not provided, the vegetation is described as luxuriant, and then there's one phrase quoted: stems thronging all around between the swell of tuft. That's pretty erotic. I wish somebody could locate what poem, or was the passage from Paul and Virginia. Swell and tuft, I'm afraid, has got to be identified exactly. The Research Library, Helen Highland, a task for you. Is my time nearly up? Somebody said yes, so it probably is. So all I will do now is remind you again, when you go upstairs, Helen, perhaps you could show them the book jacket of Volume 3 of the Joseph Brown collection, to remind them to look at Yala Waipura when you go upstairs. And there you will see fabulous but minute dotted trees along the skyline. And the adjacent paintings to this one upstairs have wonderful observation of dotted, sparse trees along the Australian skyline. One of the ultimate iconic images of Australianness, which Sidney Nolan, of course, saw wonderfully well in the 1940s in his Wimmera landscapes, and which Fred Williams similarly observed. So it's what a great accurate observer sees for Australianness, like von Gerard, like Nolan, like Williams. Go upstairs and enjoy. And a final little point that I've not yet made. This reached Australia with a rectangular frame. It's been reframed with what it had in 1862 in England. We're not quite certain what it had in 1857 in Melbourne, but on the whole, von Gerhard is very sensitive to whether he does use the fashionable curved top for his frames in the 1850s, recently fashionable, very quickly went out of fashion. But I think he deliberately used it when the composition requires it, and he does a rectangular framing job for the very Australian Yalawaipura upstairs, which is the flat landscape rather than the curvaceous Rococo landscape. Sensitive to framing, sensitive to the market, sensitive to nature, sensitive to art. And although it's not certain that he knew anything about the greatest German painter of his youth, Caspar David Friedrich, who never did anything quite like this, but who did quite amazing forests of a different conifer kind. But a couple of weeks ago, I was in Berlin, where in the old National Gallery Berlin, there's a room with a great many very big very big Caspar David Friedrichs, as well as small, intimate ones. And I was struck for the first time with two things. One, the biggest Caspar David Friedrich there is a rocky mountaintop, very like one of von Gerhard's biggest paintings, the Kosciuszko mountaintop, which you'll see upstairs and which is on the cover of one of the exhibition catalogues, that one. And the second of the two little things I noticed in that big room in the Alta National Gallery, Berlin, was a very intimate, small landscape of an agricultural valley with a nice house or two, very like a von Gerhard over there, of a German agricultural valley with a nice house or two, and the deliberate use of just a little bit of smoke or moisture coming out of the chimney of a house on a cool day in Germany. There it is in a German subject by von Gerhard. There it is several times I've now seen in similar agricultural subjects by Caspar David Friedrich. Of course, any good observer would see that, but to me it looked like a link between the greatest German painter of the time and von Gerhard, our Australian greatest painter of the time. Thank you, everybody.